Members of the Commission, with your help, your staff has developed initial findings to present to the public on the nature of the enemy that carried out the September 11th attacks. In this statement, we will focus on al-Qaeda's history and evolution and how this organization came to pose such a serious threat to the United States. These findings may help frame some of the issues for this hearing and inform the development of your judgments and recommendations. This report reflects the results of our work so far. We remain ready to revise our understanding of events as our investigation proceeds. This staff statement represents the collective effort of a number of members of our staff: Douglas MacEachin, Yoel Tobin, Nicole Grandremo, Sarah Linden, Thomas Dowling, John Roth, Douglas Greenberg, and Serena Willey did much of the investigative work reflected in this statement. We were fortunate in being able to build upon a great deal of excellent work already done by the intelligence community. Several executive branch agencies cooperated fully in making available documents and personnel for interviews. Roots of al-Qaeda. In the 1980s, a large number of Muslims from the Middle East traveled to Afghanistan to join the Afghan people's war against the Soviet Union, which had invaded in 1979. Osama bin Laden was a significant player in this group, then known as the Afghan Arabs. A multimillionaire from a wealthy Saudi family, bin Laden used his personal wealth and connections to rich Arab contributors to facilitate the flow of fighters into Afghanistan. He provided extensive financing for an entity called the Bureau of Services, or Maktab al-Khidmat. This bureau operated a recruiting network in Muslim communities throughout the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Western Europe, and the United States. It provided travel funds and guest houses in Pakistan for recruits and volunteers on the road to the Afghan battlefield. Bin Laden also used his financial network to set up training camps and procure weapons and supplies for Arab fighters. Major Afghan warlords who led forces in the battle against the Soviets also benefited from the use of these camps. Following the defeat of the Soviets in the late 1980s, bin Laden formed an organization called the Foundation, quote unquote, or al-Qaeda in Arabic. Al-Qaeda was intended to serve as a foundation upon which to build a global Islamic army. In 1989, the regime in Sudan, run by a military faction and an Islamic extremist organization called the National Islamic Front, invited bin Laden to move there. He sent an advance team to Sudan in 1990 and moved there in mid-1991. Bin Laden brought resources to Sudan, building roads and helping finance the government's war against separatists in the south. In return, he received permission to establish commercial enterprises and an operational infrastructure to support terrorism. By 1992, bin Laden was focused on attacking the United States. He argued that other extremists, aimed at local rulers or Israel, had not gone far enough. They had not attacked what he called the head of the snake, the United States. He charged that the United States, in addition to backing Israel, kept in power repressive Arab regimes not true to Islam. He also excoriated the continued presence of U.S. military forces in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War as a defilement of holy Muslim land. I'd now like to turn to Douglas MacEachin, a former Deputy Director of Intelligence of the CIA, to continue.
In Sudan, bin Laden built upon the al-Qaeda organization he had established back in Afghanistan. It had its own membership roster and a structure of committees to guide and oversee a variety of functions. At the top, the emir was bin Laden. He had a shura, or advisory council. It was made up of close associates, most of whom had served with him, long-standing ties going back to the days in Afghanistan. The Sharia and Political Committee was responsible for issuing what are called fatwas, edicts purporting to be grounded in Islamic law, directing or authorizing certain actions, including authorizing deadly attacks. Military Committee for proposing targets, gathering ideas, supporting operations, managing training camps. Finance Committee responsible for fundraising, budgetary support for training camps, housing costs, living expenses, and also the movement of money allocated to terrorist operations. Foreign Purchases Committee was responsible for acquiring weapons, explosives, and technical equipment. the Security Committee for Physical Protection, an information committee in charge of propaganda. I need to emphasize that this organizational structure should not be read as defining a hierarchical chain of command for specific operations. It served mainly as a means for coordinating functions, providing material support to operations. But once a specific operation was decided upon, it would be assigned to a carefully selected clandestine cell headed by a senior al-Qaeda operative who reported personally to bin Laden. With al-Qaeda as its foundation, bin Laden sought to build a broader Islamic army that included terrorist groups from most of the Middle Eastern countries and Africa. Not all the groups that he approached joined, but most did. And he created a multinational council, in effect an Islamic Army Council, intended to promote common goals, coordinate targeting, and authorize asset sharing for terrorist operations. This represented a new level of collaboration among diverse terrorist groups. In Sudan, bin Laden set up training camps and weapons and supply depots. He used them to support his al-Qaeda organization and also other member groups of this Islamic army. Bin Laden's operatives used positions in the businesses that he'd set up as a cover to acquire weapons, explosives, and technical equipment. And to facilitate these activities, Sudanese intelligence officers provided false passports and shipping documents. At this time, bin Laden's operational role, or al-Qaeda's operational role, was mainly in providing the funds, training, and weapons for attacks that would be carried out by members of these other groups. Let me move forward to the launching of attacks on the United States. In December of 1992, an explosion outside two hotels in Aden, in Yemen, which was being used as a stopover for U.S. troops en route to Somalia, killed one Australian tourist and no Americans. U.S. intelligence would learn 4 years later that this attack was carried out by Yemeni terrorist groups, a Yemeni terrorist group, whose leader was very close to bin Laden, whose members reportedly were trained at a bin Laden-funded camp in Sudan that was run by a member of the al-Qaeda military committee. In October of 1993, 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. 18 U.S. soldiers were killed in Mogadishu, Somalia. U.S. intelligence learned in the ensuing years that bin Laden's organization had been heavily engaged in assisting the warlords who attacked U.S. forces in Somalia. The head of the al-Qaeda military committee, from a command center in Nairobi, Kenya, reportedly sent scores of trainers into Somalia, including experts in the use of rocket-propelled grenades, the same kind of weapon that was used to shoot down those helicopters. Operatives dispatched to Somalia were told that their mission was, quote, to kill U.S. troops, incite violence against U.S. personnel, and undermine the success of the U.S. mission, close quote. Sources have described several of these operatives as bragging later that their work had caused the defeat of the Americans, and bin Laden and his senior associates touted the subsequent withdrawal of U.S. forces from Somalia in March of '94 as a victory for the Mujahideen and a demonstration that the Americans could be forced to retreat. 2 additional attacks in Saudi Arabia took place in 1995 and 1996, for which the evidence of bin Laden's involvement is much more ambiguous. On November 13, 1995, a car bomb exploded in Riyadh outside an office of the U.S.-trained Saudi Arabian National Guard. 5 Americans and 2 officials from India were killed. Saudi authorities quickly arrested 4 suspects, whom they quickly convicted and executed. The Saudis televised confessions of 3 perpetrators, indicating that their actions had been influenced by bin Laden, but there was no charge that bin Laden was directly involved. Later, March 1997, CNN interview, bin Laden denied responsibility for the attack, but he said he was sorry he had not been a participant. By the time of this interview, U.S. intelligence had learned that a year and a half before the bombing took place at the Saudi National Guard facility, al-Qaeda members and members of other aligned groups had decided to attack U.S. targets in Saudi Arabia, and they directed a team to ship explosives there. Now, this shipment is a case study in the collaboration that was going on then. Bin Laden supplied the money for purchasing the explosives. The Sudanese Ministry of Defense served as a conduit for bringing them into Sudan. They were stored briefly in the warehouse of one of bin Laden's business facilities, then transported on a bin Laden company truck under the cover of Ministry of Defense invoice papers, moved to a warehouse provided by the Ministry of Defense at a port on the Red Sea, and then transferred on a bin Laden-owned boat to Islamic Army operatives in Yemen, and from there they were moved by land to the eastern part of Saudi Arabia. So, bin Laden and his organization's role in this attack remains unclear, but the attack was consistent with the described purpose of the shipment of those explosives. On June 26, 1996, an explosion ripped through a building in Khobar Towers, an apartment complex housing U.S. Air Force personnel in Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. 19 Americans were killed, 372 were injured. Subsequent investigation concluded that the attack was carried out by a Saudi Shia Hezbollah group with assistance from Iran. Intelligence obtained shortly after the bombing, however, also supported suspicions of bin Laden's involvement. There were reports in the months preceding the attack that he was seeking to facilitate another shipment of explosives to Saudi Arabia, and on the day of the attack, he was congratulated by other members of the Islamic Army. This remains uncertain, but one thing we need to point out is that because of the historical animosity between the Shia and Sunni factions, Islamic factions, the confirmation of the Hezbollah role led many to conclude bin Laden's Sunni-populated group would not have been involved. Later intelligence, however, showed a far greater potential for collaboration between Hezbollah and al-Qaeda than many had previously thought. A few years before the attack, bin Laden's representatives and Iranian officials had discussed putting aside these differences to cooperate against a common enemy. A small group of al-Qaeda operatives subsequently traveled to Iran, and another group went to Hezbollah training camps in Lebanon for training, explosives, intelligence. And bin Laden is reported to have showed particular interest at this time in the Hezbollah truck bombing tactics used in Lebanon in 1983 that had killed 241 U.S. Marines. So in sum, we have seen now strong but indirect evidence that bin Laden's organization did in fact play some as yet unknown role in the Khobar attack. Bin Laden also explored possible cooperation with Iraq during his time in Sudan, despite his opposition to Hussein's secular regime. Bin Laden had in fact at one time sponsored anti-Saddam Islamists in Iraqi Kurdistan. The Sudanese, who wanted to protect their ties with Iraq, reportedly persuaded bin Laden to cease his support for the anti-Saddam groups and arranged for meetings between Iraq and al-Qaeda. A senior Iraqi intelligence officer reportedly made 3 visits to Sudan and finally met with bin Laden in 1994. At that time, bin Laden is said to have requested space to establish training camps, assistance in procuring weapons, but Iraq apparently never responded. There have been reports that contacts between Iraq and al-Qaeda also occurred after bin Laden returned to Afghanistan, but they do not appear to have resulted in a collaborative relationship. And 2 senior bin Laden associates have adamantly denied any ties existed between al-Qaeda and Iraq. And so far, we have no credible evidence that Iraq and al-Qaeda cooperated on attacks against the United States. Now, whether bin Laden and his organization had roles in the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center and on the thwarted Manila plot to blow up a dozen U.S. commercial aircraft in 1995 remains a matter of substantial uncertainty. Ramzi Yousef, the lead operative in both plots, trained in camps in Afghanistan that were funded by bin Laden and used to train many al-Qaeda operatives. They also trained operatives from other groups, this camp. Whether Yousef was then or later became a member of al-Qaeda remains a matter of debate. But he was, at a minimum, part of a loose network of Sunni extremist Islamists who, like bin Laden, began to focus their rage on the United States. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who provided some funding for Yousef in the 1993 World Trade Center attack and was his operational partner in the Manila plot, later did join al-Qaeda and masterminded the 9/11 attack. He was not, however, at the time of the Manila plot, a member of al-Qaeda. A number of other individuals connected to these plots or to some of the plotters who participated in them either were then or later became associates of bin Laden. But we have no conclusive evidence that at the time of these plots, any of them was operating under bin Laden's instructions. But what is clear is that these plots were major benchmarks in the evolving Islamist threat to the United States, and they foreshadowed later attacks that were indisputably carried out by al-Qaeda under bin Laden's direction. Like the later attacks, they were aimed at demolishing symbols of American power and killing enormous numbers of Americans. Like bin Laden, Yousef was willing to employ any means to achieve these ends, and he contemplated the use of non-conventional weapons. In one of bin Laden's television interviews later, he characterized Ramzi Yousef as a, quote, symbol and teacher, unquote, that would drive Muslims suffering from U.S. policy to, quote, transfer the battle into the United States, close quote. In May 1996, bin Laden left Sudan and moved back to Afghanistan. This departure resulted from a combination of pressures from the United States, other Western governments, and Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Libya, all three of which faced indigenous terrorist groups supported by bin Laden. Pressure on Sudan intensified in April 1996 when the United Nations sanctioned Sudan for harboring individuals from the group that had attempted to assassinate Egyptian President Mubarak in June of '95. At the time of bin Laden's move to Afghanistan, the U.S. intelligence community had uncovered many details of his financial and business structures and their use to support terrorist groups. Somewhat later was when he was back in Afghanistan, the news sources disclosed the nature of his organizational structure, his commitment to attacking the United States, and the extent of his organization's involvement in attacks against the United States had already been carried out. He had some changing fortunes in Afghanistan. His departure from Sudan was a setback for him. The Saudi government had already frozen his assets 3 years earlier, and the Sudanese government expropriated all of his assets there after he left Sudan. And the financial stresses that he was undergoing then strained relations with some of his associates who used the move back to Afghanistan as an occasion to break off from al-Qaeda. There were nonetheless some benefits from the move. The Sudanese, in an effort to reduce external pressures, had sought to keep bin Laden under control and had prohibited him from making public diatribes. Afghanistan's lack of a central government gave him greater latitude to promote his own agenda. Moreover, al-Qaeda had never really left the Afghanistan region. Even when it was headquartered in Sudan, it had used Pakistan and Afghanistan as a regional base and training center supporting Islamic insurgencies in places like Tajikistan, Kashmir, and Chechnya. And in August of 1996, bin Laden made public his war against the United States. In a, quote, declaration of holy war on the Americans occupying the country of the two sacred places, close quote, Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, bin Laden called on Muslims worldwide to put aside their differences and join in deadly attacks against the United States forces to compel their withdrawal from Saudi Arabia. This was a declaration we knew then that he had been making for about 4 years privately. A month later, the Taliban, an Afghan faction supported by Pakistan, seized control of Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. Bin Laden began cementing his ties with the Taliban, and they soon forged a close alliance. Taliban paid a great price for this, in the form of outside pressure, isolation, UN sanctions, and after 9/11, the destruction of the regime. But prior to 9/11, the Taliban also benefited from the relationship with bin Laden. Bin Laden provided significant financial support to the Taliban and hundreds, if not thousands, of fighters to support the Taliban in its ongoing war with other factions in northern Afghanistan. From al-Qaeda's perspective, the alliance provided a sanctuary in which to train and indoctrinate recruits, import weapons, forge ties with other jihad groups and leaders, and plan terrorist operations. Then al-Qaeda fighters could travel freely within the country, enter and exit without visas or any immigration procedures, and enjoy the use of official Afghan Ministry of Defense license plates. Al-Qaeda used the Afghan state-owned Ariana Airlines to courier money into the country. There were also ideological ties with the Taliban. Both Taliban and bin Laden espoused the vision of a pure Islamic state. Bin Laden reportedly swore an oath of loyalty to Taliban leader Mullah Omar. Relations between bin Laden and Taliban leadership were sometimes tense, and some Taliban leaders opposed the al-Qaeda presence. But in the end, Mullah Omar never broke with bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Similarly, Pakistan did not break with the Taliban until after 9/11, although it was well aware the Taliban was harboring bin Laden. The Taliban's ability to provide bin Laden a haven in the face of international pressure and UN sanctions was significantly facilitated by Pakistan's support. Pakistan benefited from the Taliban-al-Qaeda relationship, as bin Laden's camps trained and equipped fighters for Pakistan's ongoing struggle with India over Kashmir. In early 1998, bin Laden was in the early stages of what would become a merger of his al-Qaeda with another major terrorist group, the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And on February 23rd, 1998, bin Laden and the leader of this Egyptian group, Ayman Zawahiri, who is today his deputy, number 2, published another fatwa that announced a, quote, ruling to kill Americans and their allies, close quote. This was also signed by the heads of 3 other groups, but their signatures were more for a show of unity than substance. And unlike earlier statements, this fatwa explicitly instructed followers to kill civilians and military. The decree said that this ruling was, quote, an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it, close quote. And there were new attacks on the United States that followed shortly thereafter. August 7th, 1998, nearly simultaneous truck bombs ravaged the U.S. embassies in East African capitals of Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The Nairobi embassy was destroyed, 213 people were killed, including 12 Americans, and about 5,000 were injured. In Dar es Salaam, 11 more were killed, none Americans, and 85 injured. U.S. intelligence learned a few months later that the targeting of the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi began in late 1993. It was one of more than a dozen potential U.S. targets analyzed by a team residing in the same Nairobi cell that was used to provide assistance to the Somalis. In January of 1994, al-Qaeda leaders concluded that the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi would be an easy target. Preparations for the attack, the actual implementation of the attack, did not begin in earnest until late spring of 1998, and the bombs were only assembled a few days before the attacks. The night before the embassy bombing, by that time, all al-Qaeda members except the suicide squads and a few people assigned to clean up the evidence trail had left East Africa. Bin Laden and the al-Qaeda leaders in Afghanistan had also left for the countryside in the expectation of U.S. retaliation. Need to point out the attacks on these embassies in East Africa demonstrated a new operational form for al-Qaeda. They were planned, directed, and executed by al-Qaeda under the direct supervision of bin Laden and his chief aides. And this would be seen again. On October 12, 2000, an explosives-laden boat tore through the side of the USS Cole anchored in Aden. 17 members of the Cole crew were killed and another 39 wounded. In the course of the ensuing investigation, U.S. learned that an earlier attempt to attack a U.S. warship had been made in January of that year, aimed at the USS Sullivans, but had failed because the boat was overloaded with explosives. The boat was salvaged, a new martyr crew was selected, and the attack successfully carried out 10 months later. The operational commander of this attack, a person named Nashiri, had previously assisted one of the African embassy bombers. He had arrived in Yemen in late 1999 to supervise the purchase of the boat used in the attack and direct the casing and execution of the attacks. He was assisted by an al-Qaeda member close to bin Laden, who went by the name of Khalad or Tawfiq Atash. Khalad was the person who purchased the explosives used in the attack, and Khalad had also been identified as connected to the East Africa bombings. This attack followed the operational pattern shown in the East African bombings in that it was directed by al-Qaeda operatives using equipment and explosives purchased by al-Qaeda funds and carried out by members of al-Qaeda willing to be martyrs for the cause. By mid-November 2000, U.S. investigators were aware of the roles of Nashiri and Khalad and aware that they were senior al-Qaeda operatives. The one point that could not be ascertained at the time was whether they had carried out that attack under direct orders from bin Laden himself. This would not be confirmed until Nashiri and Khalad were captured in November of 2002 and April 2003, respectively. At the same time, two disrupted millennium plots demonstrated that bin Laden remained willing to provide support to attacks initiated by independent actors. Neither intended millennium attack was a traditional al-Qaeda operation. Rather, both were planned and orchestrated by independent extremist groups, which received training and assistance from al-Qaeda figures. One was a plot to destroy hotels and tourist sites in Amman, Jordan. It was planned and carried out by a Palestinian radical and his partner, an American citizen, who sought to kill Americans there. The other was the attempted bombing of Los Angeles International Airport. It was orchestrated by a person named Rassam, who conceived and prepared for the attack on his own. He commented after his arrest that he had offered to let bin Laden take credit for the attack in return for providing Rassam future funding. Both Rassam and the Jordanian cell took what they needed from al-Qaeda-associated camps and personnel, but did not follow the traditional al-Qaeda top-down planning and approval model. Let me quick look at some terrorist training camps. Many of the operatives in the African embassy and Cole attacks attended training camps in Afghanistan, as did all 19 of the 9/11 hijackers. There was a mutually reinforcing relationship between the camps and terrorist operations. The camps provided the operatives for the terrorist attacks. Successful attacks boosted camp recruitment and attendance. The quality of training provided at al-Qaeda and other jihadist camps was apparently quite good. There was coordination with regard to curriculum, emphasis on ideological and religious indoctrination, and instruction that underscored that the United States and Israel were evil and that the rulers of Arab countries were illegitimate. The camps created a climate in which trainees and other personnel were free to think creatively about ways to commit mass murder. According to a senior al-Qaeda associate, various ideas were floated by mujahideen in Afghanistan, such as taking over a launcher and forcing Russian scientists to fire a nuclear missile at the United States, mounting mustard gas or cyanide attacks against Jewish areas in Iran, dispensing poison gas into the air conditioning system of a targeted building, and last but not least, hijacking an aircraft and crashing it into an airport terminal or nearby city. These camps were able to operate only because of the worldwide network of recruiters, travel facilitators, and document forgers who vetted would-be trainees and helped them get in and out of Afghanistan. There are strong indications that elements of both the Pakistani and Iranian governments frequently turned a blind eye to this transit to their respective countries. We can conservatively say that thousands of men, perhaps as many as 20,000, trained in bin Laden-supported camps in Afghanistan between his May 1996 return and September 11th, 2001. And of those, only a small percentage went on to receive the advanced terrorist training.
We should stress that what we know now is different from what we may have known at the time. Some of what we have described was known at the time, some of it was only known much later, as we've been explaining in the course of this statement. Let me turn to the funding of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. After establishing itself in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda relied on well-placed financial facilitators and diversions of funds from Islamic charities. The financial facilitators raised money from witting and unwitting donors, primarily in the Gulf countries and particularly in Saudi Arabia. The facilitators also appeared to rely heavily on certain imams at mosques, also primarily in the Gulf countries, who were willing to divert mandatory charitable contributions known as zakat. Al-Qaeda also collected money from employees of corrupted charities. Operatives either penetrated specific foreign branch offices of large international charities, particularly those with lax external oversight and ineffective internal controls, or they controlled entire smaller charities, including access to their bank accounts. There is no convincing evidence that any government financially supported al-Qaeda before 9/11, other than limited support provided by the Taliban after bin Laden first arrived in Afghanistan. Some governments may have turned a blind eye to al-Qaeda's fundraising activities. Saudi Arabia has long been considered the primary source of al-Qaeda funding, but we found no evidence that the Saudi government as an institution or senior officials within the Saudi government funded al-Qaeda. Still, al-Qaeda found fertile fundraising ground in the kingdom, where extreme religious views are common, and charitable giving is essential to the culture, and until recently, subject to very limited oversight. The United States has never been a primary source of al-Qaeda funding, although some funds raised in the United States likely made their way to al-Qaeda. No persuasive evidence exists that al-Qaeda relied on the drug trade as an important source of revenue, or funded itself through trafficking in diamonds from African states engaged in civil wars. After raising money, al-Qaeda frequently moved its money by hawala, an informal and ancient trust-based system for transferring funds. Al-Qaeda also used couriers as a secure, albeit slower, way to move funds. Bin Laden relied on the established hawala networks operating in Pakistan, the United Arab Emirates, and throughout the Middle East to transfer funds efficiently. Hawaladars associated with al-Qaeda may have used banks to move and store money, as did various al-Qaeda fundraisers and operatives outside of Afghanistan. But there is little evidence that bin Laden or his core al-Qaeda members used banks during this period. Al-Qaeda's money was distributed as quickly as it was raised. What was made was spent. The CIA estimates that al-Qaeda spent $30 million annually, including paying for terrorist operations, maintaining terrorist training camps, paying salaries to jihadists, contributing to the Taliban, funding fighters in Afghanistan, and sporadically contributing to related terrorist organizations. The largest expense was payments to the Taliban, which totaled an estimated $10 to $20 million per year. Actual terrorist operations were relatively cheap. Although there is evidence that al-Qaeda experienced funding shortfalls as part of the cyclical fundraising process, with more money coming during the holy month of Ramadan, we are not aware of any evidence indicating that terrorist acts were interrupted as a result. Al-Qaeda today. Since the September 11th attacks and the defeat of the Taliban, al-Qaeda's funding has decreased significantly. The arrests or deaths of several important financial facilitators has decreased the amount of money al-Qaeda has raised and increased the costs and difficulty of raising and moving that money. Some entirely corrupt charities are now out of business, with many of their principals killed or captured, although some charities may still be providing support to al-Qaeda. Moreover, it appears that the al-Qaeda attacks within Saudi Arabia in May and November of 2003 have reduced, perhaps drastically, al-Qaeda's ability to raise funds from Saudi sources. Both an increase in Saudi enforcement and a more negative perception of al-Qaeda by potential donors have cut its income. At the same time, al-Qaeda's expenditures have decreased as well, largely because it no longer provides substantial funding to the Taliban or runs a network of training camps in Afghanistan. Despite the apparent reduction in overall funding, it remains relatively easy for al-Qaeda to find the relatively small sums required to fund terrorist operations. Prior to 9/11, al-Qaeda was a centralized organization which used Afghanistan as a war room to strategize, plan attacks, and dispatch operatives worldwide. Bin Laden approved all al-Qaeda operations, often selecting the target and the operatives. After al-Qaeda lost Afghanistan after 9/11, it fundamentally changed. The organization is far more decentralized. Bin Laden's seclusion forced operational commanders and cell leaders to assume greater authority. They are now making the command decisions previously made by him. Bin Laden continues to inspire many of the operatives he trained and dispersed, as well as smaller Islamic extremist groups and individual fighters who share his ideology. As a result, al-Qaeda today is more a loose collection of regional networks with a greatly weakened central organization. It pushes these networks to carry out attacks and assists them by providing guidance, funding, and training in skills such as bomb making or urban combat. Al-Qaeda remains intensely interested in conducting chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear attacks. In 1994, al-Qaeda operatives attempted to purchase uranium for $1.5 million. The uranium proved to be fake. Though this attempt failed, al-Qaeda continues to pursue its strategic objective of obtaining a nuclear weapon. Likewise, it remains interested in using a radiological dispersal device, or dirty bomb, a conventional explosive designed to spread radioactive material. Documents found in al-Qaeda facilities contain accurate information on the usage and impact of such weapons. Al-Qaeda had an ambitious biological weapons program and was making advances in its ability to produce anthrax prior to September 11th. According to Director of Central Intelligence George Tenet, al-Qaeda's ability to conduct an anthrax attack is one of the most immediate threats the United States is likely to face. Similarly, al-Qaeda may seek to conduct a chemical attack by using widely available industrial chemicals or by attacking a chemical plant or a shipment of hazardous materials. The intelligence community expects that the trend toward attacks intended to cause ever higher casualties will continue. Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups will likely continue to exploit leaks of national security information in the media, open source information on techniques such as mixing explosives, and advances in electronics. It may modify traditional tactics in order to prevent detection or interdiction by counter-terrorist forces. Regardless of the tactic, al-Qaeda is actively striving to attack the United States and inflict mass casualties.